By 8:30, when the last of the ham had taken on the resigned appearance peculiar to public catering, the village of Barley Stoke had already decided that the evening had gone badly. It had not, of course, decided why. Villages never do. They prefer a number of explanations, all mutually exclusive and all held with complete conviction by different persons who continue to borrow sugar from one another. Mrs. Dorrington, who had arranged the cold collation in the assembly rooms, considered that the trouble began when the rector thanked the wrong donor. Miss Flora Pindle, whose position in village life rested on an exact knowledge of precedents, believed it began much earlier with the placement of Mrs. Chaworth in a chair that ought by rights to have gone to Lady Chevening. Mr. Neville Tarrant, the clockmaker, later said that it began 3 months before, when sensible people allowed a restoration committee to be formed at all. The committee, having existed, had produced a result. The old clock over the market hall had been restored after 27 years of neglect, and Barley Stoke had assembled that Thursday evening to admire what it had paid for. There had been a little speech in the square, a prayer from the rector, some applause of the measured village kind, and then supper indoors beneath framed watercolours of local bridges that nobody had ever liked, but no one had yet found a way to remove. The clock itself, freshly cleaned and faintly superior, had begun its renewed career at exactly 7 o'clock. Several people had looked up when the hands were set in motion. Several more had looked up because the others were doing so. A village can accomplish a great deal by imitation alone. Mrs. Sybil Chaworth, who chaired the Restoration Committee and most other things that allowed a chair, stood near the top table receiving thanks. She was a widow of ample competence and narrow patience, with an expression that suggested she had long ago pardoned the world for disappointing her. To hear her speak, one would have imagined the clock had been restored chiefly by her moral force. At her right sat the rector, the Reverend Martin Vale, pink, conscientious, and slightly alarmed by all women who organized subscription lists. At her left sat Mr. Septimus Lyle, honorary treasurer, retired bank manager, and the only man in Barley Stoke who could make the words "receipts" available for inspection sound like a personal rebuke. Mr. Lyle had not intended to be charming. It would have been unwise to expect it of him. He was exact, tall, dry, and had the habit of folding his napkin as if it were a document requiring witness. Yet even those who disliked him admitted that his accounts were always correct. In village life, this is not the same as being liked, but it is a recognized achievement. The supper had gone on tolerably until Mrs. Chaworth rose to offer a few closing remarks. She was midway through thanking the many anonymous friends of Barley Stoke when Mr. Lyle cleared his throat. It was not a dramatic sound. It would never have succeeded in town. In Barley Stoke, where people knew one another's coughs by family, it had immediate effect. Mrs. Chaworth paused, with the air of a sovereign interrupted by the weather. "If I may," said Mr. Lyle, "there are ways of saying that phrase which signify humility." Mr. Lyle employed one of the others. Mrs. Chaworth smiled at him in a manner that would have chilled boiling water. "Of course, Mr. Lyle." He remained standing. Several ladies later mentioned this, as if it were the true offence. A seated objection may be reasoned with. A standing one has convictions. "I think," he said, "before further gratitude is distributed, it would be useful to know on what principle certain entries in the subscription book were amended after the last committee meeting." Nobody moved. Even the rector kept still, though clergymen are generally tempted to soothe scenes before understanding them. Mrs. Chaworth gave a brief laugh. "Surely this is hardly the moment. I think it is the only moment at which all interested persons happen to be present." Miss Pindle, who was present near the trifle, lowered her spoon without noise. She was not a woman to squander her attention. Mrs. Chaworth said, "If you refer to minor clerical adjustments—" "I refer," said Mr. Lyle, "to the removal of 2 pages, the insertion of a replacement leaf, and the transfer of a gift of £200 from one hand to another. There was then a silence of remarkable quality. It was not loud, it did not need to be. It went from table to table, touching shoulders. Mrs. Dorrington, who had been carrying a plate of seed cake, remained in the doorway with the expression of one who sees a hat blown under a bus and can do nothing to help. Dr. Hugh Anstruther, seated halfway down the room beside Mrs. Chaworth's niece, Judith, set down his glass rather carefully. He was the village doctor, agreeable in voice, handsome in the untrustworthy way that good-looking doctors often are, and at that moment distinctly vexed. Whether this was on Sybil Chaworth's behalf, on Judith's, or on his own, nobody could tell. Neville Tarrant, the clockmaker, leaned back against the wall with his hands in his pockets and watched. He was not on the committee, which Mrs. Chaworth regarded as one of his more offensive liberties, but he had repaired the clock and therefore possessed the immunity accorded to men who can mend machinery and ignore village politics only when it suits them. Mrs. Chaworth did not sit down. This is absurd. The alteration was made to preserve a confidence. Mr. Lyle replied, "The late Mrs. Boscawen was not a confidence. She was a donor." At the mention of the late Mrs. Boscawen, several heads turned without admitting it. Mrs. Boscawen of Cedar House had died 6 months earlier and left behind, besides a handsome house, a larger quantity of speculation than any Christian lady is entitled to expect. The matter of her will had provided winter employment for half the parish. Judith Anstruther spoke for the first time. "Mr. Lyle, if Aunt Sybil thought—" "My dear Judith," said Mrs. Chaworth, not looking at her, please. The girl coloured and was silent. She was 26, sensible, and had spent most of her life being gently overruled by older women for her own good. Mr. Lyle's voice remained level. "I will not sign the final statement unless the original entry is restored." The rector shifted in his seat. "Perhaps we might discuss this privately." "We have had that opportunity," said Mr. Lyle. There it was, not merely disagreement, but history. Dr. Anstruther stood up. "Surely this can wait until tomorrow." "Everything in this village," said Mr. Lyle, "is left until tomorrow. That is why the roof leaked for 8 years. At this, quite unexpectedly, Neville Tarrant laughed. It was not a long laugh, nor a particularly cheerful one, but it landed in the room with terrible accuracy. Mrs. Chaworth turned to look at him, and if contempt could have been entered as a line item in committee accounts, she would have done so at once. Tarrant said, "Sorry," without sound of apology. Mrs. Chaworth drew herself up. "If Mr. Lyle prefers to resign, I am sure the committee can endure the sacrifice." Mr. Lyle closed his napkin with a neatness that many found, under the circumstances, positively offensive. Resignation would suggest indifference. "I assure you, I am not indifferent." He placed the napkin on the table, bowed slightly to no one in particular, and went out. The door shut behind him. Society, deprived of its offender, made a frantic effort to continue. Mrs. Chaworth resumed her seat and announced that coffee would be served. The rector murmured something about community spirit. Mrs. Dorrington entered with the seed cake at last, and found nobody wanted it. Judith stared at the tablecloth. Dr. Anstruther bent towards her and spoke in a low tone that might have been kind, though from the other end of the room Miss Pindle said afterwards that it looked proprietary. As for Neville Tarrant, he drifted away from the wall and out into the vestibule, where he paused beneath the printed notice requesting patrons not to leave umbrellas in the corridor. He had the appearance of a man who preferred the company of wheels and springs because they seldom pretended not to mean what they had plainly done. A little later, when talk had resumed in the strained, over-bright manner of people complimenting a pudding after a quarrel, Miss Pindle happened to glance through the tall front window into the square. "The clock has stopped," she said. Nobody answered at once. Remarks of that sort are often thought metaphorical if the evening has gone poorly enough. But she was right. Over the dark front of the market hall, The restored clock stood with both hands fixed at 7:15. Mrs. Chaworth said, with more sharpness than the observation deserved. "Then Mr. Tarrant has repaired it badly." "He's not here," said Judith quietly. Indeed, he was not. It was Mrs. Dorrington who next remembered Mr. Lyle, and only because his untouched coffee had gone cold beside the plate laid for him. The absence of a man may be overlooked. The waste of refreshment is harder to ignore. The rector offered to look for both gentlemen, and Dr. Anstruther, after a moment's hesitation, went with him. They crossed the square under the stopped clock and let themselves into the market hall by the side door, which had been left on the latch for convenience. Convenience, in Barley Stoke, had never yet escaped being used against somebody. The body was found not in the clock chamber above, but in the small committee room at the back, where village ledgers, bunting, and winter drafts were stored in equal quantity. Mr. Septimus Lyle lay on the hearthrug beside the writing table, one hand tucked oddly beneath him, as if even in collapse he had attempted to maintain order. The rector said, "Good Lord," very softly. Dr. Anstruther knelt at once. From the square outside came the mild movement of people crossing for coffee and curiosity, not yet aware that the evening, which had already been unfortunate, had become something much less manageable. The first effect of violent death in a village is not grief. That comes later, after people have had time to discover precisely what they feel entitled to feel. The first effect is arrangement. Doors are shut, chairs moved. Those least useful begin to give directions, and somebody of practical temperament starts looking for a kettle. In Barley Stoke, this person was Mrs. Dorrington. Within 10 minutes of the rector's white and shaken reappearance from the market hall, she had shepherded the more fragile ladies back into the assembly rooms, sent a boy for the police from the post office telephone, removed the coffee urn from general reach, and established herself near the vestibule with a notebook she had not been asked to keep, but fully intended to use. It was not officiousness. It was the English substitute for collapse. Mrs. Chaworth had gone very pale, though not, one suspected, from nerves alone. She sat rigidly in a cane chair by the radiator, one gloved hand closed round the other, while Judith stood beside her with the dutiful air of a nurse who has not chosen the patient. Dr. Anstruther had returned to the committee room after his brief announcement that Mr. Lyle was dead and that no one must go near the back of the market hall. He had spoken with professional composure, but his face had altered. People always trust a doctor more when he looks tired. Neville Tarrant had been found, after some muttering and speculation, not fleeing the district but standing by the side entrance of his workshop across the square, smoking with the absorption of a man who knows that if he goes indoors at the wrong moment, he will be said to have hidden himself. He came back when asked, nodded once on hearing the news, and then stood apart from the rest under the framed notice about umbrellas. "Do stop looking like that, Mr. Tarrant," said Miss Pindle in a low, offended voice as she passed him. "People will talk." "I expect they will manage it, whatever expression I wear." "That," said Miss Pindle, "is not the point." It was at 9:45 that Inspector Julian Vale arrived from Market Basing, with a sergeant behind him, and the sort of unobtrusive overcoat which suggests a man unwilling to dress theatrically for other people's disasters. He was in his early 40s, clean-shaven, spare, and had a face that could look amused without becoming encouraging. There was nothing remarkable about him except that after 5 minutes in a room, one found oneself speaking more exactly than one had intended. He listened first to the doctor, then to the rector, and then asked, "Where may I put everybody without appearing to imprison them?" Mrs. Dorrington, hearing this from 3 yards away, approved of him at once. The assembly rooms were too crowded and too emotional. The market hall was impossible. The vestibule between them, with its row of pegs, the notice board, and a table bearing 6 abandoned raffle prizes from some earlier village enterprise, was finally selected as neutral territory. There, under the yellow light and the smell of damp coats, Inspector Vale began taking the evening to pieces. His manner was patient without being soft. He did not bark, and he did not soothe. He merely invited explanation in such a way that most people, anxious to appear sensible, offered rather more than they had planned. The sergeant made notes at a side table, occasionally lifting his head with the alert misery of a man resigned to spelling local surnames incorrectly. Mrs. Chaworth insisted on speaking first. "This is a shocking business," she said. "Quite shocking. I trust you understand that the unfortunate discussion earlier was merely one of administration." "Administration is often more exciting than it sounds," said Inspector Vale. "What precisely was the disagreement?" She drew herself up, recovering colour under the stimulus of disapproval. Mr. Lyle chose to make a vulgar scene over a private benefaction. A deceased friend of mine preferred discretion. I honoured that preference. By altering the subscription book? By correcting an entry that ought never to have been written so plainly. Did Mr. Lyle say who wrote it? He implied that I had. I had not. Judith shifted slightly beside her. Vale's eyes moved, rested on the movement, and moved away again. After Mr. Lyle left the supper, he asked, "Did you see him alive?" "No." "Did you follow him?" "Certainly not." Her tone was so crisp that even innocence sounded socially aggressive. Inspector Vale inclined his head as if acknowledging a point of etiquette. Judith, when her turn came, answered more carefully. "Aunt Sybil did not leave the room," she said. "At least not immediately. There was coffee. People came to speak to her. I was with her part of the time." "Part?" "I fetched her shawl from the cloakroom." "For how long?" "A minute or two." "And after that?" "She was where you saw her, or near enough. I'm sorry I wasn't timing her." "No one ever is, until it becomes useful," said the inspector. Judith looked at him then, quickly, as if uncertain whether she was being reproved. He had not changed expression. She said, "Mr. Lyle had been impossible for weeks. That doesn't mean anyone wished him dead." Miss Pindle, waiting within earshot, gave the slightest lift of the eyebrows, which in her case was the equivalent of a trumpet. Dr. Anstruther proved less manageable. Doctors dislike being questioned in villages where they have set broken wrists and attended confinements. It suggests a dangerous lowering of status. "I examined the body only briefly," he said. "There was nothing to be done." "No one imagines you omitted a miracle," said Inspector Vale. "When had you last seen Mr. Lyle alive?" "At supper, during that absurd exchange." Quote, "What was your impression of him?" "My impression?" The doctor gave a short, humorless smile. "I dislike men who make women defend themselves in public, even when the women may be wrong." Dr. Anstruther's expression altered by a degree. "You assume a good deal, Inspector." "On the contrary, I'm collecting assumptions from others. It saves time." The doctor glanced towards Judith, then back. It was a tiny thing, but not so tiny that it escaped notice. Mr. Lyle had become suspicious about money. Committees encourage that sort of disease. Suspicious of whom? Oh, everybody. Mrs. Chaworth, the late Mrs. Boscawen's solicitors, Tarrant, possibly the Archbishop of Canterbury. "Why Tarrant?" asked Lyle. He was forever saying the clock repairs had been overpriced. From the doorway, where he still stood as if unwilling to join any club that might take him, Neville Tarrant said, "Not forever, only twice." Inspector Vale turned to him. "Then you had better come and be spoken to before others improve your part for you." Tarrant stubbed out his cigarette on the sole of his shoe and approached with visible reluctance. Close to, he looked younger than some had thought, though village weather and mechanical work had put a hard finish on him. His hands were narrow, blackened in the creases despite scrubbing, and oddly delicate when still. "You repaired the clock," said Vale. "Yes." It stopped at 7:15. "So Miss Pindle has already informed everyone within 10 miles. Can you explain it?" "I can explain several possibilities. Whether any of them will please you is another matter. Begin with the truthful ones." A flicker, almost appreciation, crossed Tarrant's face. If the pendulum was checked, it would stop. If the mechanism was interfered with, it would stop. If a weight jammed because some fool had forced the access hatch, it would stop. or if someone simply set the hands afterward, it could be made to stop at whatever theatrical time they fancied. Did you go into the clock chamber after supper? No. Into the market hall? Yes. A small stirring ran through the vestibule. Mrs. Dorrington ceased writing only because she had reached the margin. When? A few minutes after Lyle left. I thought he might have gone there. Why? Because he said earlier this week he wanted to inspect the committee records where they were stored. And because when a man leaves a room after calling a woman dishonest, he generally goes somewhere to feel correct about it. Did you see him? No. I went as far as the passage and heard voices farther in. I didn't stay. Whose voices? One was Lyle's. And the other? Tarrant looked past the inspector to the coat pegs. I couldn't swear. You may describe. A man's voice. That excludes little but the vicarage cat. This time a few people nearly smiled and were ashamed of it. Tarrant said, I didn't say it was helpful. No, you have the air of a man determined to offer only true things, even when they are inconveniently small. Try mending clocks in this place, said Tarrant. You get the habit. The inspector let the silence sit for a moment. Did you dislike Mr. Lyle? Yes. That, too, made people stir. Villages are accustomed to dislike. They merely prefer it wrapped. Tarrant went on. He was mean-spirited, suspicious, and invariably right about sums under £10. It's not a combination that encourages affection. Did he owe you money? He delayed payment. For the clock? For the last instalment. Mrs. Chaworth said sharply from her chair. That was a committee matter. Tarrant turned his head only slightly. Most things are, with you. The air seemed to contract by half an inch. Inspector Vale asked mildly. And yet you laughed when he mentioned the accounts. Yes. Why? Because he chose the one moment in the evening when Mrs. Chaworth could least bear contradiction. It was unkind and beautifully timed. Mrs. Chaworth made a sound, not unlike a teacup being set down too firmly. The inspector looked from one to the other, and then beyond them, where the rector was hovering with conscientious distress, and Miss Pindle pretending to study the notice board while hearing everything. Thank you, he said. For now, I should like the subscription book, the committee minutes, and a list of everyone who entered the market hall after supper began. Mrs. Dorrington, who had already drafted half of one, lifted her notebook a quarter of an inch. Inspector Vale noticed this, as he noticed most things. Mrs. Dorrington, he said, I think you have been waiting all evening to become indispensable. She allowed herself the briefest, grimmest smile. Someone had to begin, Inspector. Excellent. Let us hope, he said, taking the notebook from her, that Barley Stoke has not been too helpful. By 10 o'clock on Friday morning, Barley Stoke had accomplished what English villages do best under pressure. It had turned calamity into visiting. People who had not called upon one another for months now found reasons to do so. Elderly ladies crossed the green with casserole dishes whose contents could not possibly assist the police, but were thought to support civilization. Men paused in front of shop windows, longer than necessity required, in case some fact should pass along the pavement. The postmistress, who possessed an admirable conscience and a weak resistance to detail, sorted letters at a speed much below her usual standard. Even the butcher served in a lower voice, as though murder might overhear. Inspector Julian Vale, who had seen this before, spent the morning at the rectory. The Reverend Martin Vale, no relation, a point both men had already clarified twice to spare everyone else. The pleasure of confusion had offered the use of his study because the police station at Market Basing was inconveniently distant, and because the rector's idea of Christian duty expanded in direct proportion to the embarrassment of the parish. His study was a room where sermons, unpaid bills, and missionary periodicals had entered into a permanent truce. On the mantel stood a photograph of the rector's late mother, looking disapprovingly into all denominations at once. Inspector Vale sat at the desk with the subscription book, the committee minutes, and a thin sheaf of notes. Sergeant Murch had gone to make inquiries at Cedar House and the Market Hall. The rector himself hovered among the bookshelves with tea, radiating the patient misery of a man whose hospitality had been accepted for purposes he would rather not examine too closely. "I do hope," he said for the third time, "that the village will not be too shaken." "It is already shaken," said the inspector. "The question is whether it becomes imaginative." The rector winced a little. "Yes, quite." The subscription book lay open under Vale's hand. Mr. Lyle had not exaggerated. 2 leaves, removed cleanly with a blade, had been replaced by 1 sheet copied in a hand, at once neat and determinedly ordinary. There are false hands, like false modesty, which aim at appearing so little themselves that they become conspicuous. The name of the late Mrs. Boscawen appeared there with a contribution of £20. Below it, in older ink, stood a sequence of lesser donations from persons whose means and vanity had already been estimated by the committee with painful exactness. Nothing in the page explained why a man had been willing to ruin a public supper over it. That, thought Inspector Vale, was often a sign that the explanation existed 3 inches to the left of the obvious. He shut the book and asked the rector, how long had Mr. Lyle and Mrs. Chaworth been at odds? The rector, being a clergyman, considered whether truth and kindness could be made to coincide. At odds is rather strong. Then let us say, how long had they found cooperation spiritually demanding? Mr. Vale looked grateful. Since the beginning of the Restoration Fund, certainly. Mrs. Chaworth is energetic. Mr. Lyle was meticulous. Those are companionable words for difficult people. The rector sat down at last, surrendering the teapot. Mrs. Chaworth believes that ends may occasionally improve means. Mr. Lyle believed means were the only part worth trusting. And you? I believe, said the rector with some dignity, that villages run chiefly on tact. The inspector glanced up. A vanishing fuel. There has been a good deal of strain, the rector went on. The committee was unfortunate from the start. Mrs. Boscawen's death complicated matters. Expectations were raised. In what direction? That she might leave something substantial to the parish. Did she? The rector adjusted his cuffs. No. This appeared to pain him not because he had expected money, but because disappointment in others always did. She left private bequests? Asked the inspector. I believe so. I am not familiar with the details. This was untrue. He was familiar with at least half the details and would have preferred to know none. Clergymen hear a great deal more about wills than is good for their souls. A tap came at the study door, followed by the entrance of Miss Flora Pindle, who had not been invited but had brought a paper parcel of scones and therefore considered herself in moral possession of the threshold. I trust I am not interrupting official business, she said, in the tone of a woman who would not dream of missing it. On the contrary, said the inspector, rising slightly, I am told you observe the village with uncommon steadiness. Miss Pindle accepted this tribute as only natural. She was small, spare, perfectly arranged, and wore dark lavender as if it were a moral position. Her eyes had the sharp brightness of pins kept for generations. I do not gossip, she said, sitting down, but I notice. The distinction sustains the country. The rector made a helpless movement with the teapot. Miss Pindle refused tea, which in itself made the room less friendly. I dare say you want to know about the supper, she said. Eventually. At present I should like to know about parish relations, in particular Mrs. Chaworth, Dr. Anstruther, Mr. Tarrant, and Mr. Lyle. My dear inspector, that is not parish relations. That is an explosive arrangement masquerading as one. The rector murmured, Flora. No, Martin, really. There is no point treating murder as if it were impolite. That, said the inspector, is admirably put. Miss Pindle folded her gloves across her lap and began. Mrs. Chaworth, it seemed, had long considered herself the natural steward of Barley Stoke's better instincts, a view supported by her purse, and opposed by nearly everyone's nerves. She gave generously, organized tirelessly, and remembered slights with the same efficiency. Dr. Anstruther had been much in her house since the winter, partly on account of her sciatica, partly because Judith had come to live with her after her mother's death, and partly, Miss Pindle implied without vulgarity, because handsome men are seldom discouraged from entering large houses where unmarried women reside. As for Judith, said Miss Pindle, she has sense, but not enough selfishness to make use of it. The rector coughed. And Mr. Tarrant? Asked the inspector. Miss Pindle's mouth compressed with interest rather than dislike. He is clever and inattentive to social gradation, which in a village is very nearly a political creed. His father kept the ironmongery. Neville inherited the workshop and a habit of saying exactly what he thinks at the least suitable moment. Women excuse it because he has melancholy eyes. Men do not because they have eyes too. And Mr. Lyle? A thoroughly disagreeable man, though not, I think, a dishonest one. He was perfectly capable of making himself hated for the right reason. Did he quarrel with Dr. Anstruther? Miss Pindle considered. Not publicly. But there was a scene outside the surgery last month. The rector looked pained. I had not heard that. Then you should go out more, Martin. Mr. Lyle came out of the surgery red in the face and said, quite distinctly, that medical men ought to confine themselves to medicine. Doctor. Anstruther answered something I did not catch, but not in a clerical spirit. Was Judith involved? Asked the inspector. Miss Pindle looked at him with approval. You do listen. She came out a minute later, looking as if she wished the pavement would open. The rector said, This is all highly speculative. Everything is speculative until one knows it, said Miss Pindle. That is the burden of intelligence. She rose, having deposited this and the scones with equal firmness, and left the study with the contained triumph of a woman who had once again been indispensable before noon. The rector gazed after her. She means well. Undoubtedly, said the inspector. It is one of the more exhausting forms of virtue. He turned back to the minute book. Committee meetings, reduced to ink by conscientious amateurs, often reveal more character than intention. People omit anger but record adjournments. They tidy motives but preserve the order of objections. 3 entries in the last 6 weeks interested him. One noted that Mr. Lyle had requested sight of all subscription records in original form. Another recorded a discussion concerning the wording of a commemorative plaque for the restored clock, Mrs. Shaworth preferring restored through the devotion of the people of Barley Stoke, while Mr. Lyle had insisted on listing major donors individually. The third, from the most recent meeting, was shorter. Matter deferred, pending clarification, with regard to the Boscawen entry. He shut the book again. Who wrote the minutes? He asked. The rector said, Judith, generally. She acted as secretary. Then I should like to see her notes, if any exist apart from the fair copy. The rector hesitated. Would rough notes matter? Rough notes always matter. Polite documents are what people decide to have meant. A little later, he crossed the green to the post office, not because the post office had any formal connection with murder, but because in villages it frequently has an informal one. Mrs. Ives, the postmistress, proved distressingly willing to be proper. I am sure I cannot say anything useful, Inspector. Then we shall not force usefulness upon you. She relaxed at once and said that Mr. Lyle had posted 2 letters on Thursday afternoon, one to Messrs. Crowder and Bell, solicitors, at Market Basing, and one locally, hand-delivered by special arrangement, because he said it was important and should not lie about in the ordinary way. To whom? Mrs. Ives pressed her lips together. That, I think, would be confidential. Inspector Vale regarded her kindly. Mrs. Ives, when a man is dead, the post grows less private. She blushed. It was addressed to Mrs. Bedecker at Willow Lodge. This was new. Mrs. Bedecker was not on the committee, was not a donor of importance, and had no visible relation to church clocks. She was, however, Mr. Lyle's married sister, a widow with weak lungs and an unusually good memory for family injuries. The inspector thanked the postmistress and walked on towards the lane behind the market hall. There he found Neville Tarrant at the base of a ladder, removing his cap to wipe his forehead with a handkerchief already defeated by oil. "You're at work," said the inspector. "I mend things," said Tarrant. "People find it reassuring, even after one of them has been killed. Especially then. A murder makes everyone notice that hinges sag." The clockmaker glanced at him and then back at the ladder. The mechanism above, now silent, had transformed overnight from village triumph to village accusation. In the square, two women crossing with shopping baskets looked up at it and then away, as though good manners required not staring at grief, even when it was bolted to masonry. "Can you tell," the inspector asked, "whether the clock was stopped before or after Mr. Lyle died?" Tarrant gave this the respect due to a real question. "Possibly when I open the casing, not from here." "Then why wait?" "Because," said Tarrant, "Mrs. Chaworth has already informed 3 people that if I go up there alone, I shall no doubt rearrange Providence. I thought I'd wait for official blessing." That was parish courtesy. That was self-preservation. The inspector smiled faintly. "You and Mrs. Chaworth dislike each other on principle?" "No. Principles are too grand. We merely improve one another's worst qualities." "And Dr. Anstruther?" Tarrant replaced his cap. "What about him? Do you like him?" "No. That is becoming a popular answer. It saves embroidery." "Does he like you?" "Less openly." Inspector Vale let that rest. Across the lane, at the side door of the market hall, Sergeant Murch emerged with a constable and a cardboard file. He crossed over and said quietly, "Found this in the committee room desk, sir. Not in the book, loose underneath." Inside the file lay a single folded sheet, rough minutes in Judith Anstruther's hand, written rapidly in pencil. Most of it matched the fair copy. One line had been struck through so heavily that the paper was scored. Inspector Vale tilted it to the light. Under the erasure, still faintly visible, were the words, "Mrs. C. said the bequest was never meant for public mention and that Gideon would have understood." "Gideon?" said Sergeant Murch. "Yes," said the inspector, looking at the paper without expression. "So it seems." He folded the sheet once more and slipped it into his pocket. Above them, the clock remained fixed at 7:15, patient and expressionless, like a witness who had decided to wait until people were ashamed enough to listen. Cedar House stood a little apart from the village, which had always suited it. Houses, like people, sometimes achieve consequence merely by withdrawing from general notice and permitting others to speculate at a distance. It was not the largest house in Barleystoke, nor the oldest, nor even the best situated, but it possessed an air of settled privacy that suggested generations of curtains had been drawn at the right moment. Mrs. Boscawen had liked that. Even now, 6 months after her death, the place retained something of her arrangement of life. The clipped yews, the gravel too carefully raked to be cheerful, the brass plate polished, as if callers were still expected, but not particularly wanted. A woman named Miss Crewe, who had been companion, housekeeper, amanuensis, and, village opinion held, occasional censor to the late Mrs. Boscawen, received Inspector Vale in the morning room with the composed resistance of one who has already answered too many questions from people not entitled to ask them. She was about 50, spare without frailty, and dressed in dark grey that looked less like mourning than a decision. Her manner was exact. One saw at once why Mrs. Boscawen, who had not been easy, had found her useful. "I have told Sergeant Murch all I know," she said, before the inspector had fully sat down. "No doubt," said Vale. "But one often remembers differently on a second attempt. It is one of our more hopeful limitations." Miss Crewe considered whether this was levity, detected that it was not quite, and said, "I knew Mrs. Boscawen for 12 years. If this concerns her estate, I cannot discuss private matters. It concerns a dead man who believed her name had been altered in the church subscription book. That, at least, moved her. Not much, but enough. She had intended to give more than £20, Miss Crewe said after a moment. How much? 200. Then Mr. Lyle was correct. I did not say the church had a right to know it. Inspector Vale crossed one leg over the other and waited. It was a gift he had, and useful. People often hurried to fill the space where another person showed no sign of helping them. Miss Crewe looked towards the window. Outside, beyond the laurel hedge, a gardener was sweeping a path that had plainly not required sweeping, but benefited from the gesture. Mrs. Boscawen changed her mind repeatedly in the last months, she said. Not about the amount, about the manner. The manner? She disliked public gratitude. She also disliked being forgotten. It made arrangements difficult. Was Mrs. Chaworth aware of the larger sum? Yes. Mr. Lyle? I believe so. He came once to discuss the receipt. Here? Yes. Did he quarrel with Mrs. Boscawen? No more than anybody else did. He offended her by being factual. Was she easily offended? No. Deliberately offended, yes. Easily, no. That, thought the inspector, sounded like a just distinction. He asked, and who was Gideon? Miss Crewe's head turned sharply. It was not theatrical surprise, merely the very quick adjustment of a mind that had expected one difficulty and found another. Mrs. Boscawen's husband, she said. Gideon Boscawen. He died 15 years ago. Then the note in the rough minutes referred to him. If there was such a note, I suppose so. You do not sound astonished. Mrs. Chaworth had known them both for years. She sometimes spoke of Mr. Boscawen as if he remained an available authority. And would he have understood? The corners of Miss Crewe's mouth altered by the smallest degree. Mr. Boscawen understood his wife extremely well. Whether that is the same thing, I cannot say. It was, in the village manner, a great deal more informative than an answer. She rose and crossed to a writing desk. From it, she took a narrow leather case and returned with a folded paper. This is a copy, she said. The original is with the solicitors. Mrs. Boscawen dictated it to me 3 weeks before she died. It was not part of the will. It was a letter, unsigned in this copy, and addressed to Mrs. Sybil Chaworth. The language was stiff, almost playful in places, and thoroughly private. Mrs. Boscawen confirmed her intention of contributing £200 to the Clock Restoration Fund, but added that she had no wish to be nailed upon the parish wall like a charitable woodpecker. She preferred the gift to be made quietly, unless the village insists, in which case I shall be dead and beyond correction. Under that came another paragraph. You will understand, dear Sybil, that I make this gift in memory of Gideon, who cared absurdly for clocks and did not care in the least what was said of him after luncheon. If there is any dispute over my name, I leave it to your sense of proportion, which has occasionally surprised me. Inspector Vale read this twice. Mrs. Chaworth kept the letter. She took the original away. And Mr. Lyle knew of it? I cannot say. I know only that he came here after the funeral and wished to inspect papers. Mrs. Boscawen had never liked him. I declined. You and he were not friendly? Mr. Lyle considered personal feeling an administrative weakness. Yes, said the inspector. I am beginning to miss him. Miss Crewe let this pass. She did not approve of charm when attached to police work. At the gate of Cedar House, he encountered Mrs. Bedecker. She had arrived on foot from Willow Lodge, wrapped in a coat too heavy for the weather, and carrying the sort of determined umbrella which suggests long acquaintance with disappointment. Mr. Lyle's sister was a smaller, softer version of him, as if nature had drawn the same features once with steel and once with blunt pencil. Her eyes, however, were alert and perfectly unlike his. There was humor in them, though not enough to have improved family life. I supposed I might find one of you here, she said. "Your sergeant told me you were asking about my brother. He always did prefer dead women's business to living people's comfort." Inspector Vale held the gate for her. "You received a letter from him yesterday?" She looked at him straight. "So the post office has remembered its public duty. It rarely forgets for long." Mrs. Bedecker gave a brief noise that might once have grown into laughter under better conditions. "Yes, I had a letter. I also had one last week, and another the week before. Septimus only wrote when he was certain of being right, or certain of being insulted." "Which was this?" "Both." She did not offer the letter at once. Instead, she walked with him a little way down the lane, as though choosing the air in which to discuss her brother. That in itself told him she had liked Septimus Lyle as relatives, sometimes like the people least possible to admire. Without comfort, without illusions, and too late to be useful. "He believed someone had tampered with the subscription book," she said. "He said if anything happened to him, I was to show the letter to the police. Since something has happened to him, here we are." She handed it over. The letter was written in Lyle's small, hard hand, each line disciplined against emotion and failing only in the final paragraph. "I do not suggest melodrama, but if Sybil Chaworth persists in treating records as a species of embroidery, I may be forced to speak publicly. She has some absurd notion of protecting the Boscawen matter. Protecting whom, I am not yet certain. There is more beneath it than vanity. Anstruther is mixed up in some way, though whether by design or weakness I cannot say. Tarrant knows something, or thinks he does. If I am wrong, I shall be made ridiculous. If I am right, I shall be inconvenient. You know how such things go." Inspector Vale folded the letter slowly. "Did he say what he suspected about Dr. Anstruther?" "No, only that the doctor was too often where he needn't be. Septimus disliked men who entered houses by the drawing-room and left by the garden. That is a very precise dislike. My brother specialized in them." They had reached the bend where the lane turned back towards the square. From there, the market hall clock could be seen above the roofs, still motionless at its accusatory 7:15. Mrs. Bedecker looked at it and said, "Septimus hated displays. It would be like this, of course." "You were close?" "As close as people like Septimus permit. He was kinder than most believed." "In what way?" "He remembered things for others. Debts, anniversaries, promises, medicines. He could do it offensively, but he did do it. That counts for something in families." "Yes," said the inspector. "It often counts for the wrong thing." She gave him a look not unlike professional respect. When he returned to the village, he found Dr. Anstruther outside the surgery, speaking to Judith in a low voice. They stood nearer than convention liked, though not nearer than affection permits when watched. Judith's hat was pushed back a little, and one hand moved restlessly over the buttons of her gloves. The doctor's tone was controlled, but his control had begun to show its edges. They broke apart at the inspector's approach in exactly the wrong way. "Inspector," said Anstruther, "have you news?" "Only that the dead continue to be conversational." Judith flushed. "Have you been to Cedar House?" "Yes." "Then you know Aunt Sybil wasn't inventing the contribution. She very seldom invents. She rearranges." The doctor's face sharpened. "Surely you don't suggest she had anything to do with Lyle's death?" "I suggest nothing while people are still so willing to suggest for me." Anstruther put his hands in his coat pockets. "This is becoming intolerable. The village will make a pantomime of it." "Villages generally do," said the inspector. "The difficulty is that they cast by memory, not evidence." Judith said quietly, "Mr. Lyle thought someone was being protected." Inspector Vale looked at her. "Did he say so to you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "On Wednesday. He asked whether loyalty was a virtue when attached to the wrong person." "And what did you answer?" "That it depended which person one meant." The doctor turned his head sharply towards her, not quite in warning, not quite in surprise. It was a small movement, and therefore highly visible. The inspector noticed it, as did Judith. So, from the other side of the street, carrying a basket she had no urgent need to carry, did Miss Pindle. One never solved a village mystery through fingerprints, if one could first understand who had spent too long managing whom. "Thank you," said Inspector Vale. "For the present, that will do." He moved on towards the square, leaving behind him the doctor, the young woman, and the weight of something imperfectly spoken. Behind the market hall windows, the committee room remained shuttered. Above it, the clock still kept its false time, while all over Barleystoke people continued, with admirable confidence and almost no information, to put the evening into order. The rectory held tea on Fridays not because anyone greatly enjoyed it, but because the Reverend Martin Vale believed, with the touching persistence of his profession, that regular hospitality might prevent irregular malice. In prosperous years, this theory had merely tired his wife. In difficult ones, it became a form of parish maintenance, like mending a wall before frost. Mrs. Vale, a competent woman with a face that had long ago ceased expecting peace from others, received her guests that afternoon in the drawing-room with the controlled resignation of one accustomed to serving sponge cake in the vicinity of scandal. She did not object to Inspector Julian Vale's presence. She merely treated him as she treated all inconvenient necessities, by improving the chairs and not mentioning it. The room itself was too warm. A coal fire had been lit out of habit rather than need, and the air carried the mingled scents of tea, furniture polish, and primroses brought in from the garden to prove that spring had been consulted. On a low table stood plates of thin bread and butter, currant buns, and a seed cake which Mrs. Dorrington later identified, privately and with satisfaction, as bought rather than made. Mrs. Chaworth arrived first, in dark blue and self-command, bearing the expression of a woman who had decided that if people intended to discuss murder in her hearing, they should at least do so in proper rooms. Judith came with her, quieter than usual, and took a chair by the window. Miss Pindle followed 2 minutes later, explaining that she had not wished to be early, which was her habitual way of indicating that others had been. Mrs. Dorrington appeared burdened with a small basket of scones, just in case, as though the rectory might fail morally in baked goods. Last of all came Mrs. Bedecker, to the mild surprise of everyone but the inspector. "Mr. Vale asked if I should object," she said, laying aside her gloves. "I do not, as a rule, object to tea." This was not strictly true. She objected to many teas, but not enough to miss them. The gentlemen of the village were mostly absent. The rector had been called to see an elderly parishioner who chose crises with strong theological timing, and Dr. Anstruther, though invited, had sent a note pleading surgery hours. Mrs. Chaworth read this in silence when it was handed round, and folded it with the small, exact movement of a woman placing one more disappointment in reserve. Inspector Vale stood near the mantel for some minutes before sitting down. He had the tact to make his watchfulness appear accidental. Women who would have stiffened under official questioning often found themselves talking quite freely over a teacup, particularly if the subject appeared to be something else. For a little while it was. The weather, the state of the church kneelers, the rector's view that chrysanthemums were not suitable for the Lady Chapel, and a distressing rise in the price of marmalade all received their portion of attention. Yet in rooms where everyone has come because of one thing, lesser topics do not conceal it. They merely circle. It was Mrs. Dorrington who first moved them nearer. "I do think," she said, pouring tea with a firmness that suggested she blamed someone, "that when all is said and done, a public quarrel is always unfortunate." Mrs. Chaworth accepted her cup, "particularly when it is manufactured." "My brother," said Mrs. Bedecker, "was not good at manufacturing. He preferred plain damage." Miss Pindle looked into her saucer, as if admiring the honesty of this. Judith, by the window, kept her hands folded in her lap too tightly. Inspector Vale said, "Had Mr. Lyle many enemies?" Mrs. Chaworth gave a short laugh. "My dear Inspector, in a village One does not need enemies. One merely needs exact opinions. Then let us say persons he made uneasy. Half the parish, said Mrs. Dorrington, before she could stop herself. Mrs. Vale intervened with bread and butter, a serviceable tactic when candour threatened to become enjoyable. Miss Pindle took a bun and remarked, "He made men uneasy more than women. Women are used to being corrected. Men take it as innovation." "That is an alarming generality," said the inspector. "It has the merit of being accurate." Mrs. Choworth said coolly, "Septimus Lyle made a special point of suspecting women with responsibilities." Mrs. Bedecker turned her cup once on its saucer. No, he suspected people who preferred influence to explanation. There was no raising of voices. None was required. The room went still in the way of rooms, where everyone is suddenly listening to what has long been thought and never before said at table. Mrs. Choworth's glance moved to her and rested there. "You imply a distinction." "I imply a habit," said Mrs. Bedecker. "My brother irritated people because he would not leave facts in decorative condition." Judith spoke unexpectedly. "He was not always factual. He could be cruel because he enjoyed being certain." It was the first sharp thing she had said in company since the inspector had met her. The effect was immediate and oddly disproportionate, as first sharp things often are. Mrs. Choworth turned towards her. "Judith." The young woman did not colour, which was perhaps more significant than if she had. "It's true." Miss Pindle, who had been preparing to think this herself, now had the pleasure of hearing it done. Inspector Vale said mildly, "Did Mr. Lyle speak cruelly to you, Miss Anstruther?" Judith looked at the tea things. "He implied I was careless with the committee notes." "Were you?" "No," Mrs. Choworth answered before anyone else could. "Certainly not." Judith went on as though she had not heard. "He said rough notes should not disappear unless someone wished them to." Mrs. Dorrington set down the milk jug too quickly. "Disappear?" Mrs. Chaworth said, "This is becoming absurd. Draft papers are constantly destroyed." "By whom?" asked the inspector. "By anyone with a sense of order." Mrs. Vale, whose sense of order was both profound and innocent, observed, "I keep old lists for years. One never knows." There was a brief silence in which everyone saw, as clearly as if it had happened in the room, old pages being kept or discarded, not from tidiness, but from preference. The inspector turned slightly towards Judith. "Did you destroy any rough minutes?" "No." "Did Mrs. Chaworth ask you to?" Again the pause. Very slight, entirely sufficient. "No." Mrs. Choworth lifted her chin. "Really, Inspector? I cannot permit insinuations against members of my own family." "I have not asked your permission," he said pleasantly. It was so gently said that Mrs. Vale, who had been moving the cake plate, nearly smiled. "To soften nothing and alter everything," Miss Pindle remarked. "There was a good deal of pressure after Mrs. Boscawen died. Everyone behaved badly in different keys." Mrs. Dorrington, relieved to have the moral discussion shifted away from the cake, nodded. "The will upset expectations," Mrs. Bedecker said. "Whose?" No one answered that directly, so she supplied it herself. Sybil's, perhaps. The doctor's, certainly. Judith's, by implication. And Lyle's because he expected disappointment and got secrecy, which offended him more. Judith looked up sharply. "Dr. Anstruther had nothing to do with Mrs. Boscawen's will." Mrs. Bedecker's expression did not change. "I did not mention the will." Mrs. Chaworth said in a tone of dangerous civility, "I think we should leave Dr. Anstruther out of village invention." "Then village invention should stop placing him in your drawing-room every evening," said Miss Pindle, before good sense could catch her. Mrs. Vale made a soft, despairing sound and began offering more cake to nobody. Judith had turned quite pale. "That is unfair." "Is it?" Miss Pindle asked, not kindly. "To which of you?" If she had slapped the girl, the room could hardly have altered more. Mrs. Choworth half rose. Mrs. Dorrington said, "Flora," in pure horror. "Mrs." Bedecker shut her eyes for 1 second, not from fatigue, but because she recognized the shape of irretrievability. The inspector, who had not moved, said, "Miss Pindle, we are discussing appearances, not composing them." This restored proportion without restoring comfort. Judith stood up. "I don't see why I should sit here and be discussed as if I were a vase moved from house to house," she said. Her voice trembled only at the end, which made it better than steadiness would have done. Mr. Lyle disliked Dr. Anstruther. He disliked Aunt Sybil. He disliked almost everyone who attempted to manage anything. That does not mean one of them killed him. "No," said the inspector, "it does not." She looked at him then with something like appeal, though perhaps it was only the wish to hear reason spoken in a room full of conclusions. Then she left the drawing-room by the French window instead of the door, which Mrs. Vale would have considered melodramatic in anyone else, and therefore found alarming in Judith. Mrs. Chaworth remained standing for a moment, before sitting down again with great control. "You see," she said, not looking at anyone in particular, "what damage is done by idle talk." Mrs. Bedecker folded her gloves with the same economy as her brother. "Idle talk seldom invents weakness," she said. "It merely chooses an audience." The inspector let no one speak for a few seconds. Through the window he could see Judith moving slowly across the lawn towards the side gate, not hurried, not composed, but in the peculiar condition of someone who has at last ceased enduring a conversation and has not yet decided what must be endured next. When he glanced back, he found Mrs. Chaworth watching the same figure with an expression very different from the one she presented to the room. It was not anger, it was calculation burdened by alarm, and there was affection in it too, though of the possessive and exhausting sort. That was useful, not because it proved anything, but because it made one of the easier explanations less comfortable than it had been an hour before. Mrs. Vale rose and began clearing cups with the swift competence of women who know that if emotional wreckage is not accompanied by physical tidying, the day becomes impossible. No one mentioned another bun. A subscription book, in country life, is rarely only a subscription book. It begins as a ruled ledger for money and becomes almost at once a register of rank, generosity, resentment, memory, and those delicate retaliations by which one household keeps level with another. It records who gave promptly, who promised in language mistaken for payment, who preferred anonymity from humility, and who preferred it because the amount would not bear public daylight. In a village, a list of donations may tell one less about finance than about the private arrangement of souls. Inspector Vale spent most of Saturday morning with the clock fund ledger open on the rector's dining-room table, while Sergeant Murch stood at the window and looked as a practical man looks when obliged to think about other people's handwriting. "It seems a lot of trouble," said Murch, "to alter 2 pages merely to lower one dead lady's contribution." "Yes," said the inspector, "which is why I do not think that was the only purpose." The sergeant turned from the window. "Then why do it?" Vale tapped the book with one finger. "Because people almost never remove what is merely offensive. They remove what is connected." He had sent for Mrs. Dorrington, not because she was an official custodian of committee papers, but because everyone in Barley Stoke eventually handed papers to Mrs. Dorrington, who kept them flat, dry, and morally supervised. She arrived in a hat of determined black straw and sat down as one accepting a burden placed on weaker hands. "I have been thinking about the book, Inspector," she said at once. "It was forever going about." "So I understand." "No, I mean literally. Mrs. Chaworth had it, then Judith had it, then Mr. Lyle. Then it would turn up under the tea-urn, or on the piano in the assembly rooms, or once in a manner I did not care for at all on the passenger seat of Dr. Anstruther's motor car." Inspector Vale looked up. "When was that?" "In February, after the musicale at Cedar House." "A fundraising event?" Mrs. Dorrington gave him a quick glance of approval. "That was what it was called. In practice, it was an evening during which ladies were expected to admire Schubert and men were maneuvered towards pledges." Successful? In raising money, yes. In preserving temper, not entirely. She leaned over the table. Those missing pages were from about then. I am nearly sure of it. How nearly? Mrs. Dorrington disapproved of vague percentages. Near enough that I should be surprised to be wrong. What makes you think so? Because that was when the larger promises began. Before then, it was all half-crowns, 10 shillings, the sort of giving one can mention without apology. After Cedar House, there were substantial amounts. Dr. Anstruther gave £50. Lady Chevening gave 75, after hearing that Mrs. Choworth had given the same. Miss Crewe sent 10, though without attending. And Mr. Tarrant— She paused. Yes? Mr. Tarrant did not subscribe in money. He wrote that he would undertake the restoration at cost and with such labour as may be required. I remember it because Mr. Lyle made a noise in his throat when he saw it and asked whether labour could be entered in a book intended for pounds. Sergeant Murch shifted slightly. Inspector Vale remained still. Are you certain of the wording? He asked. Not word for word, but certainly that was the sense. And it was on one of the missing pages? I cannot swear to the page, but it was around that part of the book. The Cedar House names were grouped together because Mrs. Choworth said it looked more orderly. Order, said the inspector, is so often the enemy of explanation. Mrs. Dorrington, who believed this in theory but not with linen, considered the remark and let it pass. When she had gone, Vale sat for a while without speaking. Tarrant offered labour, said Murch at last. Then later he sends a bill and Lyle objects. That gives them a row worth having. Walt, it gives them a history worth understanding, said the inspector, which is better. He closed the ledger and took it himself across the square to the market hall, where the committee room had been released for inspection under conditions of police patience. The shutters were open now. Daylight fell with unkind impartiality on the folding table, the cupboards of bunting, the iron grate, and the patch of hearthrug where Septimus Lyle had died. Rooms where death has occurred do not alter much. One's opinion of furniture merely declines. Judith Anstruther was there before him. She stood at the table, arranging papers into exact piles, not because anyone had asked her to, but because untidy documents are intolerable to people whose feelings have become so. She looked up when he entered and made no pretense of surprise. Aunt Sybil said you might come, she said. Then your aunt is learning optimism. It won from her the faintest reluctant smile, which vanished almost at once. I am only putting things together, she said. Mrs. Dorrington said it was worse to leave papers lying about. Mrs. Dorrington and civilization are now indistinguishable. He laid the ledger on the table. Miss Anstruther, did you copy the replacement page? Her hands, which had been aligning envelopes, stopped without drama. That was answer enough, but he waited for the spoken form. Yes, she said. On whose instruction? Aunt Sybil's. Did you know the original pages had been removed? I knew one had. She looked at the book, not at him. I did not count them. Why copy it at all? She said the page had become stained, and that Mr. Lyle was being impossible over nothing. Did you believe her? No. It came out so simply that one trusted it at once. Why do it then? Judith gave a small movement of the shoulders, hardly more than a breath pushed outward. Because she had already decided. Because she said, if the list were made neat again, the whole foolishness would stop. Because in this village one spends half one's life preventing scenes started by people old enough to know better. An excellent description of local government. She looked tired rather than amused. I copied only what she marked. Only? Yes. He opened the book and turned it towards her. That interests me. Mrs. Dorrington tells me the missing pages included the Cedar House subscriptions, Dr. Anstruther's gift, Lady Chevening's, Mr. Tarrant's offer of labour, perhaps others. Judith's head came up quickly. Not guilt, this time, alarm of a more practical kind. I never saw those, she said. But if 2 leaves were removed, and you copied only 1, what did you suppose had become of the rest? For the first time she had no immediate answer. It was not a silence of calculation. It was worse, the silence of a person discovering how much she has chosen not to examine. "I thought," she said at last, "that Aunt Sybil had taken a summary from them elsewhere." "Why?" "Because," she said, the later entries were provisional. "Were they?" "I don't know." He let that remain between them for a moment. "Did Mr. Lyle speak to you about the book on Wednesday?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "That if I meant to serve as secretary, I ought to distinguish between fair copies and accomplices." Her colour rose now, belatedly and with anger. It was hateful. "Yes," said the inspector, "and sometimes useful, which is the difficulty." She moved away from the table to the window. Outside, the square went on with Saturday business under the stopped clock. A boy was wheeling a bicycle too large for him. 2 women came out of the grocer's discussing pears with that strenuous emphasis by which people avoid mentioning murder. Judith said, still looking out, "Mr. Tarrant did not cheat the committee." "That is a determined remark. It is also true. He offered his labour at cost for the original repairs only. Then Aunt Sybil wanted the face re-gilded, and Lady Chevening insisted the bell must be reset, and Mr. Lyle demanded a proper invoice for everything, because he said goodwill was not auditable. The whole thing altered. So Mr. Tarrant's bill was not a betrayal. No, only a nuisance. Who explained that to Mr. Lyle? No one successfully. He watched her a moment. "And Dr. Anstruther's subscription?" he asked. Judith turned back. "What about it? Was it paid?" She hesitated. This time the hesitation had edges. "I don't know," she said. It was not convincing. It was, however, the first unconvincing thing she had said. Before he could press it, voices sounded in the passage, Mrs. Chaworth's clear, carrying tone, and behind it, Neville Tarrant's lower one, disagreeing without haste. They entered almost together, each having plainly attempted not to arrive in company and failed. Mrs. Chaworth stopped short on seeing the open ledger. "What is that doing here?" "Being educational," said the inspector. Tarrant's eyes went to the book, then to Judith, then to Mrs. Chaworth. His face altered very slightly, in the manner of a man who sees an old annoyance become newly explicable. "Ah," he said. It was not an exclamation. It was recognition. Inspector Vale rested one hand on the ledger. "I begin to think," he said, with mildness that caused nobody any comfort at all, "that this book has been put to more uses than subscription. There are few things so revealing as what people choose to mention when they have decided not to tell the truth." Inspector Vale reflected upon this on Sunday afternoon while standing beside the duck pond behind Willow Lodge, listening to Mrs. Bedecker explain that the white drake could not be trusted. The observation was delivered with such calm authority that it might have been theological. "He looks placid," said the inspector. "That is how he gets near the others," said Mrs. Bedecker. "Then he bites." The drake, hearing himself discussed, moved through the water with a composure that supported neither innocence nor remorse. Around him the ducks made the usual low, conversational sounds of creatures who appear to have solved life by refusing to hurry. Willow Lodge had once been the dower house to something grander, and had since retired with dignity into smaller means. Its gardens sloped behind the house, in a manner designed to suggest negligence without ever quite achieving it. Mrs. Bedecker, who had weak lungs and strong judgments, liked sitting there after luncheon when weather allowed and visitors did not. She had asked the inspector to call, not because she possessed sudden evidence, but because, as she put it in her note, some recollections improve by being spoken before one gets tired of them. The inspector had come at once. In villages, recollections deteriorate rapidly if left among relatives. "You said yesterday," he began, "that your brother wrote only when he was certain of being right or certain of being insulted. On which side was he, in the end?" Mrs. Bedecker considered the drake. "Both, still. Septimus could continue a grievance with the dead if given stationery." You think he had found something substantial? Yes, but not, I imagine, the thing he believed. That was better than most answers he had had all week. Mrs. Bedecker adjusted the rug over her knees. She was one of those women whose fragility appears at a distance and disappears upon acquaintance. Up close, one saw only discipline. My brother had become absurd about Sybil Showorth, she said. Not absurd in suspecting her, that is a very ordinary occupation, but absurd in supposing she was the center of everything. Sybil likes to be central. It encourages mistakes. And what should he have looked at instead? Dependencies. The inspector waited. She did not at once continue. Instead, she nodded towards the pond. That drake is a perfect fool for crusts. If I threw bread now, every duck would come. But not for the same reason. Two would come because they were hungry, one because the others did, one because it cannot bear another duck to be fed first, and the white brute because he wishes to make trouble look like appetite. That is village life. An unusually severe natural history. It is accurate. Septimus saw pecking and called it motive. He was often right, but not enough. Inspector Vale watched the ducks for a moment. It was the sort of digression people later describe as irrelevant, which is why it often matters. He said, "You believe one person's behavior is being explained by another's when it should not be." "Yes." "Whose?" Mrs. Bedecker did not answer directly. She looked instead at the line of pear trees beyond the pond, all carefully netted against birds. "Judith Anstruther is not a fool," she said. "That is the difficulty. If she were, one could lay things at Aunt Sybil's door and go home. Yet you think Judith has concealed something. Of course she has. So has Sybil. So has the doctor. Probably Tarrant too, though from irritation rather than principle. The village is full of concealment. The question is, who is concealing what for whom? And your brother? He concealed contempt under punctuality. It served him badly. The inspector smiled faintly. That is not evidence. No. But it may save you time. He turned the conversation back. Did Mr. Lyle ever speak to you of Dr. Anstruther's finances? At this, she glanced at him more sharply. Why that? Because the subscription entries from the Cedar House musicale appear to have included the doctor's £50. Miss Anstruther was less clear than she might have been when I asked whether it had been paid. Mrs. Bedecker settled herself more firmly in the chair. Ah, it was the smallest sound possible, and precisely the one he wanted. You know something. I know, she said, that Septimus was asking questions at the bank in March. Not official questions, family ones. He said the doctor was living a little beyond a country practice and a motor car that ought already to have been sold. Did he say why he cared? He said, "A man who cannot afford generosity should not advertise it in subscription books." That had the ring of Lyle complete. Did your brother believe the doctor had not paid? I think he believed the money came from somewhere it ought not. Mrs. Chaworth? Mrs. Bedecker's mouth tightened. That was one possibility. Cedar House was another. The Boscawen estate? Or something Mrs. Boscawen had intended before she changed her arrangements. Septimus could never resist a path if it led through impropriety. They were quiet a moment. The white drake glided towards the bank, hopeful and unscrupulous. The inspector said, "You do not sound shocked by the prospect of impropriety." "My dear man, I have been married. I am shocked only by inefficiency." That nearly made him laugh, which was inconveniently pleasant in the circumstances. From the side gate came the sound of footsteps on gravel. A maid appeared with a tray, and behind her, Miss Pindle, who had plainly encountered the maid at some intermediate point and attached herself to the household with customary inevitability. "I hope I do not interrupt," said Miss Pindle, carrying interruption like a visiting card. "Only the ducks," said Mrs. Bedecker. Miss Pindle sat down with the briskness of one who does not ask whether she may contribute. She assumes society would suffer if she did not. She had, she said, been to the cemetery with primroses for her sister, and had then thought it neighborly to call. Since Willow Lodge lay in exactly the opposite direction from the cemetery, this explanation did not survive its own delivery, but no one disputed it. Tea was poured. The ducks resumed being decorative. "I have remembered something," said Miss Pindle, taking this as her cue. "I should have mentioned it earlier, but the week has been trying, and one cannot carry every imbecility in the parish in the front of one's mind." "Tell me," said the inspector. "At the Cedar House Musicale, after the subscriptions were taken, I happened to pass the little writing room near the morning room. The door was ajar. Mrs. Chaworth was there with Dr. Anstruther. Mrs. Bedecker said dryly, 'That narrows nothing.'" Miss Pindle ignored this. They were not alone in the compromising sense. They were arguing, very quietly, which is worse. Mrs. Chaworth said, "I shall not have Judith made ridiculous for a sum of money." The doctor said, "It is not Judith who will be made ridiculous." Then they heard someone in the passage and ceased to have opinions. The inspector set down his cup. "You are certain of the words?" "Substantially. I have never been sentimental about memory." Mrs. Bedecker watched her over the rim of her cup. "And you did not mention this before because—" "Because," said Miss Pindle with dignity. "At the time, I assumed it concerned an engagement." There was a pause in which Mrs. Bedecker looked, for the first time that afternoon, very nearly entertained. "Your error," she said, "was almost charitable." Miss Pindle allowed that people had said so. Inspector Vale said, "Did you tell Mr. Lyle?" "No, but he may have guessed something. He came into supper that night in a temper and asked whether committees were now collecting for the clock or underwriting romance. I thought it beneath me to inquire what he meant." "That," said Mrs. Bedecker, "must have cost you." Miss Pindle accepted the thrust as no more than she had earned. The inspector looked across the pond, not seeing it. Judith made ridiculous for a sum of money. Not Judith. A quarrel disguised as prudence, a subscription perhaps unpaid, or paid by the wrong hand. And Lyle, following the scent with his usual relish for moral untidiness, had chosen at last to speak in public. A late afternoon breeze moved the surface of the water into small ripples. The white drake made for the bank again, saw no bread forthcoming, and abandoned civility at once. Mrs. Bedecker said, "You look as though the ducks have been educational. They have improved the village." "Impossible," said Miss Pindle. "No," said the inspector, rising, "only rearranged it." He took his leave a few minutes later and went back towards the square by the footpath behind the allotments, where Sunday quiet lay over the village like a sheet lightly spread over untidy furniture. Ahead of him, the market hall clock remained stopped, the hands fixed where someone had wanted them fixed. Below it, people would already be preparing for evening service, for supper, for speculation renewed in cleaner collars. He had not yet decided who killed Septimus Lyle, but he had begun to see that several people were protecting Judith from a humiliation which might never have been hers to bear, and that such protection, like charity and ducks, could be offered for reasons too different to be trusted. On Monday morning, the village awoke with the grave expression of people who had not slept well but meant to behave as if they had. Shops opened on time, bicycles went about their business. The baker's boy whistled once in the high street, remembered himself under the stopped clock, and fell into a more suitable silence. Barley Stoke did not know what to do with murder, but it knew exactly what to do with Monday. Inspector Vale spent the first hour in Market Basing, not at the police station, but at the branch of the County and Agricultural Bank, where Septimus Lyle had once made a profession out of mild discouragement. The acting manager, a younger man with neat hair, and the hunted civility of someone promoted too early, had been helpful in the way officials are when they suspect the dead used to terrify them. By 11:30, the inspector was back in the village, walking up the drive to Cedar House with no visible haste and a good deal to think about. Miss Crewe received him in the morning room again. There was no surprise in her expression this time, only a slight contraction which suggested that visitors bringing fresh difficulty should at least have the decency to ring less firmly. "I am afraid," she said, "Mrs. Chaworth is resting." "That is unfortunate. I wanted to trouble her." "Rest is not always a protection from trouble." "No," said the inspector, "only from callers." Miss Crewe considered this and then said, "You had better come in." Cedar House in daylight was less severe than from the lane. One noticed books, the careful placing of flowers, chairs meant for use rather than admiration, and here and there those small domestic adjustments which prove that a strong-willed woman had not lived alone in spirit, whatever the census might have said. On the escritoire stood a silver photograph frame turned slightly away from the room. Inspector Vale, who had no gift for not noticing things, saw that it held an elderly man with a broad forehead, amused eyes, and the look of one who had survived matrimony by treating it as weather. Gideon Boscawen, presumably. Miss Crewe followed his glance. "He was easier than she was," she said. "That often happens." "With Mr. and Mrs. Boscawen," said Miss Crewe. "It happened by design." She remained standing. People who stand too long in their own rooms either wish to end the visit or to control it. In her case, it was both. "I have just come from the bank," said the inspector. "There was a deposit made to the Clock Fund account in March, in cash, for £50. It was entered under Dr. Anstruther's name." Miss Crewe's face did not alter much, but one saw that she had expected a different approach. "Yes?" The banknotes were brought in by Mrs. Chaworth. That produced silence. Not alarm, precisely. More the stillness of somebody who has been proved right in an unwelcome direction. "So," said the inspector, "either Mrs. Chaworth was acting as courier for the doctor, which is improbable on character, or she paid his subscription herself." Miss Crewe moved to the mantel and touched the silver frame into a straighter line. "Did she tell you that?" "No." "I thought I would offer her a final opportunity to be candid. That is charitable. It is economical." Miss Crewe turned. "Then I should save your economy. Yes, Sybil paid it." "Why?" "Because the doctor had promised more than he possessed." "And she knew?" "She knew enough." "And Miss Anstruther?" Miss Crewe hesitated, which in her case was nearly eloquence. Judith knew he was in difficulties. She did not know, at first, that Sybil had intervened. At first? Later, she guessed. The inspector sat down without invitation, which startled Miss Crewe not because it was rude, but because it implied he meant to stay until things became clearer than anyone preferred. "Let us have the whole of it," he said. Miss Crewe did not immediately comply. She went to the bell, then changed her mind and came back without ringing. The refusal of refreshment is often a confession's opening prayer. Dr. Anstruther had borrowed imprudently, she said. Nothing criminal. A motor car, some investment a cousin persuaded him into, a taste for appearing more secure than he was. Men do this very often and call it temporary. He made his subscription at the musicale in a moment of vanity or honor. With some men, the two are difficult to separate. Afterwards, he could not pay. And Mrs. Chaworth discovered this. Yes. From him? Not directly. From Judith first. There it was. The village's true method of disclosure. Not letters, not accounts, but anxious confidence between women who thought they were preventing distress. Miss Crewe went on. Judith was engaged to him, quietly, not publicly. Sybil disliked the match, but disliked public collapse more. When she understood that the promised £50 had not been paid, she settled it herself and instructed Judith to say nothing. She said no good would come of humiliating a man over a subscription. Inspector Vale folded his hands. That was the kindness? Miss Crewe gave him a look almost severe enough for Mrs. Bedecker. It was a kind act, badly chosen, and worse managed. Sybil's kind acts usually are. She helps by taking possession. And Lyle found out. Yes. How? I believe he noticed the deposit and asked questions. He had a talent for locating weakness and treating it as evidence. Did Dr. Anstruther know Sybil had paid? Miss Crewe said, eventually. Was he grateful? She gave the faintest possible smile. Inspector, have you ever met a proud man, under obligation to a woman he does not love? That depends how much time you have. Miss Crewe let the smile go. He was furious. So was Judith. Sybil could not understand either reaction. To her mind, she had averted disgrace, and perhaps purchased influence. This time Miss Crewe did not pretend not to understand. Yes, she said. Before he could ask more, the door opened, and Mrs. Chaworth entered, not resting at all. She was very well dressed in dove grey, which on another woman might have suggested delicacy, but on her looked like strategic mist. Her colour had returned, and with it the authority she wore, as others wore pearls. I thought, she said, I ought not to let Alice conduct my scandals for me. Miss Crewe made no apology. She merely sat down at last. Inspector Vale rose slightly and resumed his chair. I understand, he said, that you paid Dr. Anstruther's subscription. Mrs. Chaworth removed her gloves finger by finger. I advanced it. Did he repay you? No. Did you expect him to? Eventually. I am not philanthropic to medical men. Why conceal it? Because it would have been intolerable for Judith. There was feeling in that, real enough. The difficulty with Mrs. Chaworth was never that she felt too little. It was that she felt proprietorially. She was engaged to him, said the inspector. Yes. Is she still? Something passed over Mrs. Chaworth's face, too quick for grief and too genuine for mere annoyance. No. Since when? Since Friday morning. That was new, though not altogether surprising. One could almost hear half the village adjusting its internal furniture. Mrs. Chaworth sat opposite him and laid the gloves beside her with excessive neatness. You see now, she said, what Septimus was threatening. Not money, exposure. Judith had given her word to a man who had made himself ridiculous, and I would not have her dragged through public meanness over £50 and a ledger entry. Yet you altered the book in a way that made public suspicion inevitable. I altered a page. Septimus turned it into drama. Did he confront you privately first? Repeatedly. He enjoyed private confrontation because it allowed him to rehearse for public virtue. It had the ring of truth and of hatred, matured by long application. Inspector Vale said. And on Thursday evening? He forced the matter in front of the whole room. I could have killed him for it. Miss Crewe closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Chaworth, hearing herself, lifted her chin. Well, she said, I could have, if I were that kind of woman. Since I am not, the remark will save you trouble. It saves me none, said the inspector. A great many people had reason to resent Mr. Lyle's devotion to plain speaking. Yes, said Mrs. Chaworth, but only some had reason to fear it. He let that stand. Outside, on the drive, a car drew up too fast and stopped too abruptly. Miss Crewe moved to the window and said, without turning, Dr. Anstruther. Mrs. Chaworth's expression hardened at once into a composure so complete that one new fury lay directly under it. How suitable, she said. A moment later, the doctor was shown in. He looked tired, angry, and less handsome than usual, which improved him when he saw the inspector. Then Mrs. Chaworth, then Miss Crewe. He understood at once what kind of room he had entered and hated it. I came to speak to Sybil, he said. You may as well speak to all of us, said Mrs. Chaworth. Secrecy has done enough. The doctor remained standing. Very well. Since it appears impossible to preserve anyone's dignity in this village, I should like it understood that I never asked for your money. No, said Mrs. Chaworth. You merely benefited from it. For Judith's sake. For your own. Their voices remained level. That made the exchange far worse. Inspector Vale watched them in silence. The wrong kind of kindness, he thought, never ended when the money changed hands. It continued in every obligation denied, every humiliation postponed until it grew expensive, every effort to spare a person, by deciding on their behalf what they could endure. It did not yet tell him who killed Septimus Lyle, but it told him, with increasing precision, what several people believed they were saving and why the attempt had made everything more dangerous. On Tuesday morning, Inspector Vale went up into the clock chamber with Neville Tarrant and discovered that time, like charity, is easiest to falsify when everyone has already agreed on what it ought to look like. The chamber was smaller than most imaginations had made it. From the square below, the market hall clock suggested grandeur. From within, it proved to be a cramped loft of beams, dust, metal, and long acquaintance with pigeons. The mechanism stood in its frame with a sort of sullen dignity, as if it resented being made relevant to human conduct. Tarrant moved about it with ease, not affectionately, but with the settled comprehension one gives to difficult things that have at least the virtue of consistency. "Well?" said the inspector. Tarrant did not answer at once. He bent over the movement, touched nothing for a while, and then made a brief noise in his throat. "That's interesting." "Encouraging words," said Vale. "They generally precede inconvenience." Tarrant straightened. The hands were set back. The inspector, who had expected something of the kind without being sure why, only said, "How far?" "About half an hour." He pointed with a screwdriver, not touching the works. If it had truly stopped at 7:15, the quarter strike would stand here. It doesn't. The chime train has gone beyond the half-hour position, not much beyond. Whoever interfered with it stopped the pendulum after 1/2 past, then moved the hands back. So the clock lied. "No," said Tarrant. "A clock doesn't lie. It gets made to." They were quiet for a moment in the close wooden space, with the village sounds below rising faintly through the tower. A cart, a dog, somebody calling for a child not worth the effort. "Could anyone have done it?" asked the inspector. "Anyone with fingers. It doesn't require a diploma, only the nerve to climb up here and meddle." "You sound disappointed." "I'm a tradesman. I dislike mystery when plain incompetence will do." The inspector glanced out through the opening beside the dial. From there the square looked tidier than any life conducted in it had a right to be. "Then somebody borrowed half an hour." "Yes." "Which means Mr. Lyle may have lived until 7:45. Or thereabouts." Tarrant wiped his hands on a rag already blackened by use and leaned against a beam. "You suspected that anyway," he said. "I suspected that villages do not notice time accurately unless trains are involved. This is better." Tarrant gave him a look of limited approval. "If you're asking whether I set it back, no. I was not asking. You were about to." "That," said the inspector, "is only because you have the manner of a man forever half-confessing to things he hasn't done." Tarrant almost smiled. "Occupational habit." When they came down into the square, Mrs. Dorrington was crossing with a basket, and the unmistakable air of one who had been waiting to be accidentally useful. "I have just been considering the supper," she said before either man spoke. "The timing of the coffee was later than people think." The inspector held the door for her into the market hall vestibule. "How much later?" "Well, after 1/2 past. Mrs. Choworth had not finished collecting herself, and the urn had to be fetched from the side table because Mr. Wicks had put it absurdly near the radiator. Then someone wanted more cups. It was all behindhand. Was Mr. Lyle's cup poured immediately? No, it was set out, but the coffee itself was later. I remember because by then everyone had started pretending to enjoy themselves again." She lowered her voice a little, not from secrecy but from civility. "And Dr. Anstruther was absent." "For how long?" "I cannot say exactly. Long enough for Miss Pindle to notice and decide it meant something, which, of course, may mean nothing at all." "In this village?" said Tarrant. "Impossible." Mrs. Dorrington gave him a look, which suggested that sarcasm from mechanics was one of the country's lesser trials. "Was Mrs. Choworth absent?" asked the inspector. "Yes, briefly. She said she had a headache and went to the cloakroom. Judith was not with her then." "And Judith?" Mrs. Dorrington hesitated. I thought she had gone out by the side passage. I may be wrong." "Mrs. Dorrington," said the inspector gently, "you are almost never wrong. You are sometimes merciful." She accepted this with mixed feelings. Judith was found later in the churchyard, where she stood beside the yew tree reading a monument with the fixed attention people give to stone when they do not wish to be looked at themselves. The churchyard of St. Tite. Luke's lay just beyond the green, sloping mildly away from the lane, with old headstones leaning into one another like tired relatives. She did not start when the inspector approached. That in itself told him she had heard him coming and chosen not to move. "You have found out about the clock," she said. He did not ask how she knew. In Barleystoke, information travelled by methods too intimate for police procedure. "Yes." She touched the edge of the stone before her with one gloved finger. "Then the evening is worse again." "Not worse," he said, "only longer." That drew from her a very small and weary smile. He stood beside her without pressing at once. Beyond the low wall a cart went by, the horse placid under public uncertainty. "At tea on Friday," he said, "you were angry at being discussed." "I still am." "Understandably. Unfortunately, private emotions have been behaving very publicly." She looked straight ahead. "You want to know where I was?" "Yes." "For that half hour?" "Yes." Judith took a breath and let it out carefully. "I was with Hugh." She said the doctor's Christian name not tenderly, but from old habit, which was more affecting. "Where?" "By the side gate of the rectory garden at first. Then we walked as far as the lower lane. No one was meant to see us." "Why meet him there?" "Because after Mr. Lyle's scene, I knew everything would come out. The money, the subscription, Aunt Sybil's interference, all of it. I had been living inside other people's arrangements for months, and suddenly I could hear them collapsing." Her voice remained level, but only because she had brought it under discipline, too late for comfort. "What passed between you?" "I told him I would not marry a man whom my aunt had to rescue like a schoolboy from a debt book." "That was severe." "It was accurate." She turned then, and there was no self-pity in her face at all, only fatigue and anger, long delayed, because she had been trained to keep rooms smooth. He said he had meant to repay her. He said Aunt Sybil had acted without his consent. He said Mr. Lyle was a vindictive brute, and I ought not to let one unpleasant man ruin everything. And I found I no longer knew whether everything meant him or my aunt, or merely the trouble they had made between them. "So you ended it?" "Yes." "How long were you together?" She looked towards the lane, as if the answer might still be lying there. "Until nearly 7:45. Perhaps a little earlier. I came back across the churchyard. Hugh went towards the square. That was clear enough at least, to place the doctor in the missing half hour." "Why did you not say so before?" "Because I would not have our engagement broken in private and exhibited in public on the same evening. Because Aunt Sybil would have called it melodrama. Because Hugh was already ridiculous enough without my helping. Choose whichever seems most feminine and inconvenient." "I shall choose truthful," said the inspector. She gave him a quick glance, surprised, into something almost like gratitude. "Then choose that I was ashamed," she said. "Not of him, exactly. Not even of myself, of how easily one can be managed into silence by people who mean to spare one." The inspector looked down at the worn grass between the graves. "Yes," he said, "that is often the wrong kind of kindness." From the tower, the stopped clock showed still its innocent falsehood to the village below. Half an hour had been taken from the evening and hidden in plain sight. Judith had spent it ending an engagement. Dr. Anstruther had spent it being refused. And Septimus Lyle, meanwhile, had remained alive somewhere in Barleystoke, while everyone above their cups and courtesies supposed the drama had already happened. When the inspector left the churchyard, he did so with the uncomfortable certainty that the doctor had lied, but perhaps not about the thing most worth fearing. By Tuesday evening, Inspector Vale had become dissatisfied, not with what Barleystoke had told him, but with the care it had taken to remain civil while doing so. The village had provided motives in abundance, movements in fragments, and indignation by the yard. What it had not provided, until now, was vulgarity in its original form. Everything had been tidied on the way out of people's mouths. Mr. Lyle had been impossible, Dr. Anstruther upset, Mrs. Choworth protective, Judith distressed. No one had quoted the phrases most likely to wound, though those were precisely the phrases that mattered. He thought of this while standing in the assembly rooms after dusk, with the chairs still stacked from some earlier usefulness and the draught under the door behaving as if it had paid for the building. Mrs. Dorrington sat at one end of the room with her notebook. Miss Pindle sat at the other with an expression of principle. Between them, in a position chosen perhaps for balance and perhaps for theological courage, the rector looked as if he regretted his species. Inspector Vale remained standing. "I am going," he said, "to ask an uncivil question, and I should like an uncivil answer, on Thursday evening." What exactly was said after Mr. Lyle left the top table? Miss Pindle folded her hands. "We have already told you." "You have told me what it meant. I now want the words." The rector shifted. Mrs. Dorrington inspected her notebook with stern unhappiness. It was Miss Pindle who yielded first, though not out of softness. "I did not repeat it," she said, "because it was gross." "That recommends it." She gave him a sharp look, discovered no encouragement in his face, and went on. After Mr. Lyle left the room, there was a small disturbance in the vestibule. People were pretending not to notice. Dr. Anstruther had followed as far as the door, not quite into the corridor. Mr. Lyle turned back and said something to him. "What?" Miss Pindle disliked the sentence even now. "That made it more trustworthy," he said. "If Miss Anstruther means to marry you, sir, she ought at least to know who paid for your name in my book." The rector shut his eyes. Mrs. Dorrington said quickly, "I did not hear the first part, only the end of it." "And the doctor's reply?" asked the inspector. Miss Pindle hesitated. It was not reluctance to gossip, it was reluctance to be seen possessing the thing. He said, "Keep Judith out of this," rather sharply. "Only that?" Mrs. Dorrington looked up from her notebook. "Not only that." The room became very quiet. He said, Mrs. Dorrington continued, with the painful exactness of a woman honouring truth against taste, "Keep Judith out of this, you filthy little clerk." Then the rector came through from the supper room, and everyone behaved as if nothing had been said. The rector coloured at once, partly from hearing the insult now, partly from realising how much he had not heard then. "I don't remember that," he said weakly. "No," said Miss Pindle, "you arrived at the Christian stage." Inspector Valley did not smile. "So that," he said, "is what people chose not to repeat." "It seemed kinder," said Mrs. Dorrington. "To whom?" No one answered. He let the silence stand, then asked, "Did either of you see what happened immediately after?" Miss Pindle said, "The doctor went out by the side door. Mr. Lyle remained in the vestibule a few seconds. He looked." She searched for the right term and disliked all of them. "Vindicated?" the inspector suggested. "Ugly," she said. "In the moral sense." Mrs. Dorrington nodded. He was pleased. That was the worst of it. "And Mrs. Choworth?" "She was still in the supper room," said Mrs. Dorrington, trying to speak as though the evening had not happened. That was likely true. It also reduced one possibility and sharpened another. Inspector Vale thanked them and left the assembly rooms, taking with him the rector, who insisted upon accompanying him into the square on the pretext of air, and immediately regretted the weather. "I had no notion," said the rector, hurrying his scarf into better behaviour, "that Lyle had been quite so offensive." "No," said the inspector, "nor, I think, had anyone who might have wished to forget it later." The stopped clock looked down upon them with its usual false serenity. "Do you think," asked the rector, lowering his voice from instinct, though the square was empty, "that the doctor killed him?" "I think," said the inspector, "that public humiliation and private debt are bad company. I also think villages are most loyal, precisely where they ought to be most exact. The rector absorbed this without pleasure. At the surgery the lamps were lit, but the last patient had gone. A maid in a checked apron said the doctor had just come in from a call and would see the inspector if he must. The phrasing suggested that within the profession there remained some doubt about necessity. Dr. Anstruther received him in the consulting room, standing beside the desk with one hand on the back of the chair. The room smelled faintly of carbolic, wet wool, and a day poorly concluded. He had taken off his coat, but not his fatigue. His face, in the brighter light, showed the strain he had so far held a little away from him by force of manner. "You again," he said. "It saves," introducing myself. The doctor did not ask him to sit. The inspector sat anyway. "I have been hearing exact words," he said. Anstruther's expression altered very slightly. "From whom?" "From people who wished they had not heard them. That narrows nothing. On the contrary, it narrows your evening." The doctor moved away from the chair to the mantel, then back again. A restless man in a confined room always seems guiltier than he may be, which is one reason police stations are arranged as they are. "You know Judith ended the engagement before Mr. Lyle died," said the inspector. "Yes." "You told me nothing of that." "It was not your business. Once a man is murdered, very little remains outside my business." Anstruther's mouth tightened. "I saw no need to drag her into a public misery." "No, you preferred to keep the misery private and drag the lies instead." For a second, something like anger cleared the doctor's tiredness. "I did not kill Lyle." Inspector Vale looked at him. "That is not the sentence I had asked for," he said. The doctor turned away. On the desk lay a stethoscope, 2 prescription slips, and a sealed envelope addressed in a woman's hand. Domestic order imposed upon inward disorder. One saw at once why patients trusted him and why intimates would be unwise to do so. "At the vestibule," said the inspector, "Lyle told you Judith ought to know who paid for your name in his book." Anstruther said nothing. "Was that the first moment you understood Mrs. Choworth had paid the subscription?" "No." "When did you know?" "Friday morning," said the doctor, still not turning. "She told me, after Judith broke with me. She told me as if she were handing over a receipt for my character. That had the ring of injured truth, and of something else besides. Shame, perhaps, or hatred of dependence. In some men, the two are indistinguishable. And on Thursday night? I knew only that Lyle had discovered something. I knew he meant to use it. I followed him out because I wanted him to leave Judith alone." "Did you meet him again after that?" The doctor faced him then. There was no panic in him, which would have been easier. Only exhaustion and the remains of pride. "Yes," he said. "I met him again." Inspector Varley rose. Outside, in the square, the clock still showed 7:15 to a village that had already begun, from kindness, embarrassment, and habit, to tell the story in a way it could bear. On Wednesday afternoon, Inspector Vale went to Cedar House and asked, with perfect civility, whether Mrs. Chaworth would spare him 10 minutes. As he was shown into the drawing-room, Miss Crewe looked at him with the grave expression of one who has already measured the amount of truth a room may bear and found it unequal to the demand. Mrs. Chaworth was by the window. Judith sat a little apart with her hands clasped, and Dr. Anstruther stood on the hearthrug in the uneasy attitude of a man who has come because absence would look worse. Nobody appeared surprised to see anyone else. This is one of the less cheerful signs of approaching explanation. Inspector Vale declined tea. "That," said Mrs. Chaworth, "sounds ominous. It is only practical. Tea encourages interruption." He remained standing for a moment, then sat down in the chair nearest the door, as if to make leaving available to everyone, though not immediately. "The clock," he said, "did not stop at 7:15. Nobody spoke. Judith's hands tightened. The doctor looked at the carpet. "It was stopped about half an hour later," the inspector went on, "and the hands were put back. Mr. Tarrant has confirmed it. So what mattered on Thursday did not end with the public scene. It continued afterward, in private, which is always more troublesome. Dr. Anstruther said, with visible effort. I told you I met Lyle again. Yes, and I now know when. After Miss Anstruther ended her engagement to you, you went back to the market hall and saw Lyle in the committee room. Judith shut her eyes briefly. Mrs. Choworth turned her head with a movement so quick it was almost maternal, and therefore not at all restful. The doctor said, He was alive when I left him. I believe you. That altered the room more than any accusation might have done. The doctor looked up sharply. Why? Because you are vain, weak under obligation, and unwise in speech. But you are not, I think, a man who can turn public humiliation into murder within half an hour and then remember to compose a false scene with a church clock. You have never shown the least talent for arrangement. A curious expression crossed Judith's face. Pain, unwilling amusement, and something like relief. Mrs. Choworth said coldly. Then perhaps we may all go home. I'm afraid not, because the person who altered the clock was not arranging an alibi in the strict sense. She was arranging a story. There was then a silence so complete that even Miss Crewe, by the writing desk, seemed to have ceased the small inward preparations by which she met unpleasantness. Inspector Vale folded one hand over the other. 7:15 was not chosen at random. It was the memorable time, the public time, the time of Mr. Lyle's scene at supper and of everyone's embarrassment. Any person merely seeking safety would have done something cruder, a round hour perhaps, or no time at all. But 7:15 was the moment the village had already fixed in its mind. To place the death there was to make it belong to the public quarrel and not to what happened later. Judith had gone very pale. No, she said under her breath. Mrs. Choworth did not look at her. Go on, Inspector. He did. Mr. Lyle believed he was exposing dishonesty in the subscription book. In fact, he was exposing something more ordinary and more destructive, kindness of the wrong kind. Doctor, Anstruther promised a subscription he could not pay. You paid it, Mrs. Choworth, to save Judith from the indignity of discovering she was engaged to a man already borrowing against appearances. Then you had the entry altered, and Judith, out of loyalty, or fatigue, or both, copied the replacement page. Mr. Lyle saw enough to understand that someone had been protected, but not enough to understand how badly. Judith said, I never meant— No, said the inspector gently. None of you meant half of it. He turned to Mrs. Choworth. On Thursday night, after Judith broke with the doctor, you understood that Lyle would not let the matter rest. Not now, not when the engagement had failed. He would say, publicly if necessary, that Judith had copied the false leaf and that your money had paid for Dr. Anstruther's name in his book. You could bear accusation against yourself. You could not bear Judith being made ridiculous. The doctor moved abruptly. If this is meant to suggest— It is meant to suggest, said the inspector, that when you left Lyle, you left him alive and disagreeable. Mrs. Choworth went to him afterward. No one interrupted now. She did not go to kill him, Vale said. Had she intended that, we should have a much less clumsy evening to account for. She went to stop him speaking, perhaps to recover the original pages, perhaps merely to insist, as she has insisted all her life, that things be handled in her fashion. For the first time, Mrs. Choworth's composure altered. Not much, a tiny thinning round the mouth. The sort of change one sees when a strong woman discovers that another person has noticed the exact shape of her weakness. He refused, said the inspector. More than that, he was cruel. Cruel in the way of men who feel morally armed. I think he said that Judith would have to bear her part of it, that she had copied the page and would look exactly what village people would be most eager to call her: conniving, foolish, compromised. Something of that order. Judith made a faint sound, not of surprise, but recognition. The doctor looked at her, then away. Mrs. Choworth's voice, when it came, was perfectly level. He said she had helped me buy a husband. Nobody moved. It was one of those sentences which, once spoken aloud, seemed to drain a room of all but its essentials. The inspector inclined his head very slightly. "Yes," he said. "I thought it might be something unforgivable of that sort." Miss Crewe shut her eyes. Judith stood up, but only to sit down again almost at once, as though the body had obeyed before the mind could. Mrs. Choworth went on in the same even tone. "I took hold of the book. He would not let it go." He laughed. She looked not at them, but at the window where the ewes stood in their usual grim patience. He slipped on the edge of the rug and went back against the fender. It was absurdly quick. One does not imagine death can behave so abruptly in committee rooms. No one contradicted her. There was nothing in the room now to contradict with. "I thought," she said, "that if it were known to have happened then, after Judith had left the supper, after her affair with Hugh had ended, everything would fasten itself upon her, or him, or both, and what had actually occurred would not matter in the least. So I went upstairs and stopped the clock. At 7:15, said the inspector. "At the worst moment already available," said Mrs. Choworth with sudden bitterness. It seemed economical. There was dry humour in that, dreadful and accurate. For a second, one saw the whole village laid out in her mind, like a room to be straightened before callers arrived. Judith said, "Aunt Sybil." Mrs. Choworth turned then, and the expression on her face was not the one the village knew. It was older, stripped of authority, and burdened by love that had too often mistaken itself for management. "My dear," she said, "I have been preventing your humiliation for so long that I quite forgot to ask whether you might prefer your own." It was, Inspector Vale thought, the most truthful thing she had said in a week. Dr. Anstruther took a step forward, stopped, and did not attempt nobility. It would not have suited the room. The inspector rose. "I shall need a statement," he said. "The rest will follow in the usual way." Mrs. Choworth nodded. Of course. There was no scene, no collapse, no cry, no dramatic offer of sacrifice from the doctor, no desperate protest from Judith. Only the quiet disorder which comes when people who have arranged one another's lives too carefully are at last obliged to leave them untidy. As Vale reached the door, Miss Crewe said, "Inspector." He turned. The clock? Outside, over the market hall, the hands still stood where panic had placed them, preserving a false version of events for a village that had been only too ready to accept it. "Tarrant is seeing to it," said the inspector. "It will go again this evening." Mrs. Choworth gave a small nod, as if that at least were fitting. When he crossed the square, an hour later, Neville Tarrant was coming down from the tower, carrying his tools in one hand, and looking as though he had been obliged to converse with stupidity in mechanical form. "Well?" said the inspector. "It's running," said Tarrant. He glanced up at the dial, where the hands had resumed their proper office. "About time." The inspector looked at the clock, then at the village beneath it, already beginning the long work of absorbing truth into habit. "Yes," he said, "for once.